Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
You likely know the pain of having a flight delayed or canceled or even overbooked. Anger, frustration, whining, annoyance, listen, even tears. All of these are fair reactions. But most delays, or even cancellations and overbookings, are one-time, short-term events. You sit and you wait a few hours, or the storm passes and you come back tomorrow, or they find you a seat on another flight. Yeah, it sucks, but on you go. Sometimes, however, a wrench is thrown into the system, and absolutely everything goes to hell.
Since Friday we've been here, they canceled on us in the middle of the night, and they told us to wait and to stand by, and we've been waiting here, and we've been since every single day since Saturday. I've been on the phone for 10, 15 hours trying to get a hold of a WestJet agent, and they don't answer, or the phone hangs up, and they have to call again, right?
That is just one of more than 100,000 people who were impacted by a strike that lasted just over a day, but was still playing havoc with travelers more than a week later. The aftermath of the WestJet mechanic strike is worth examining for a few reasons. For starters, why did it take a week or longer just to get the company back up and running flights properly? Why could customers who were stranded across the hundreds of routes the company flies not reach anyone to rebook their flight? What kind of compensation are passengers owed? And why will thousands of them have to fight just to get it? And why, after a highly publicized passenger Bill of Rights, has Canada's transport agency not managed to offer more to stranded flyers than a place to file a complaint? I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Christopher Reynolds is a reporter with the Canadian Press based in Montreal who has been covering the WestJet mechanic strike and the lengthy fallout from it, I guess, Chris.
That's right. It was only a 29-hour strike, and yet we've felt the effects for over 2 weeks.
So why don't you just explain, first of all, what happened when WestJet's mechanics went on strike? When was this? And can you describe what the initial disruption was?
Yeah, so some 680 plane mechanics walked off the job on the Friday before the Canada Day long weekend. And these folks are critical to operations. They do inspections and repairs daily. An airline cannot function without them. And on June 28th, they stopped working, largely over wage concerns, and after several weeks of escalating tensions with WestJet. And this resulted in, on that weekend alone, the Canada Day long weekend, between the Thursday evening and the Monday of July 1st, some 1,000 plus cancellations, flight cancellations, on one of the busiest travel weekends of the season.
And I guess these folks are so critical that no planes can fly if these guys aren't working.
Yes, that's almost the case. Some planes can keep going if there's a skeleton crew of contractors who might be able to do some inspections of a few planes. And I think that daily inspection requirements might have some kind of 24-hour window. So the strike starts, and it's not like all planes have to be on the ground immediately, but within a very short time after. I think WestJet's 180-plane fleet was down to something like 30 within about 24 hours.
You mentioned the strike was really short, but even still, do we have a sense of what the resulting numbers were in terms of cancellations or even just in terms of people impacted?
Yeah, over a week and a half period, there were about well over 1,300 cancellations, and at least 170,000 passengers were affected based on arithmetic from WestJet. And it's not like you would think, okay, 29-hour strike, maybe 29 hours of cancellations. But an airline has to wind down its operations in anticipation of a possible strike. They have to make sure their planes aren't scattered across the 175 destinations where WestJet flies to. They have to consolidate crews, pilots, and flight attendants. And they have to concentrate their fleet so that it's ready to go in large hubs when this strike is eventually over. And they also have to worry about stranding passengers. They don't want to do that either. So that's the logistics of winding down. Winding up also takes some time when you have a fleet spanning 3 continents and nearly 200 destinations as well.
You mentioned that they don't want to strand passengers, but did they? You talked to a number of people who were impacted by this strike. Can you share some of the stories you heard? Like, what actually happens to someone who is caught in the middle of this all of a sudden?
Yeah, absolutely. Thousands and thousands of travelers on Canada Day long weekend, as the situation turned out this time. Messages and social media posts from scores of passengers that I received conveyed exasperation over hours spent on hold with customer service, the carrier's failure to rebook them on other airlines, as is their obligation after a certain amount of time, and even flight cancellation notices that sometimes informed passengers that, quote, fees may apply, even though it wasn't the passenger that canceled the flight. So, one BC resident I spoke with was on hold for 30 hours, never got through to an agent. She made it home 6 days late. Another man said the airline alerted him 4 days after his canceled flight to Costa Rica that he had been rebooked. But this person was already in Central America, having bought tickets with another airline because he wanted to get down there. So canceling the rebooked flight apparently would incur a $200 fee, WestJet told him, and the remaining refund would only be in WestJet travel credit. And there were folks stranded across the continent, sometimes for days on end, and also building up a lot of extra costs, either through the hotels they had to stay at because they couldn't get on board a flight, or through the rebooked flights that they themselves did with other airlines. So this caused a lot of disruption to a lot of Canadians and others too.
We'll talk about the money in a few minutes and who pays and who doesn't. But just first, once the strike ended, what kind of logistics need to happen in order to, to your point, figure out where people are and how to get them back, figure out who's bought themselves a new flight and doesn't need to come home, all of that stuff. How do you handle that?
Yeah, that is a dizzying array of logistics. Again, the operations side of the fleet itself is one very complex set of procedures that has to happen in order to get planes to their various destinations. But then handling customer service, these are thousands of passengers who are going to be demanding either reimbursement for flights rebooked with other airlines or still trying to get rebooked, demanding refunds that might not have come through, perhaps demanding follow-up on a so-called cancellation fee should they have chosen a refund. Airlines aren't typically equipped to handle a tsunami of hundreds of thousands or scores of thousands of complaints following a cancellation. So there is a long tail to this strike just in dealing with the customers alone, and one that could cost the airline millions of dollars.
Just how long is that tail? Again, you mentioned this is one day right before the long weekend. We're in the middle of July. How long did it take everything to get back up and running normally and everyone to get home? And has that happened yet?
Roughly a week after the strike ended, there were still a much higher number of flights being canceled by the airline than is ordinarily the case. And I was looking it up on a flight tracking site. Even yesterday and the day before, there was a much higher proportion of flights being called off by the carrier than at its competitor Air Canada, for example. Sometimes WestJet, which is a much smaller airline, had more flights being canceled than Air Canada. That means a much higher ratio as well. So it seems like there are still knock-on effects, though for the most part, now that we are, well over 2 weeks after the strike ended, mostly the airline has got its operational ducks back in a row.
How did the company handle the rebooking process while the strike was in effect and in the days right afterwards? Because this is, I gather from your reporting and stuff I've read elsewhere, this is going to become the issue that whatever happens next is fought over, right?
Yeah, it seems like that's the case. They were so caught off guard by the strike because the labor minister, Seamus O'Regan, had imposed binding arbitration, ordered that to happen through the country's labor tribunal. And yet the workers went ahead with the strike regardless. And the board, the Canada Industrial Relations Board, ruled the day that the strike happened that was okay because the labor minister had not explicitly barred a strike from happening as binding arbitration was underway. They were so caught off guard by this, WestJet, along with the government, that they barely had time to handle any customer relations, it seems. They barely had time to deal with getting their flights canceled and their planes grounded, much less handling and treating passengers. One person I spoke with said a couple weeks ago that he hadn't received a single email from the airline since his family's June 30 flight to Toronto from Cancun was canceled 16 hours before departure. He said WestJet, quote, ignored us, ruined our vacation, cost him an extra $2,500 when they rebooked on Delta Airlines. And so the rebooking problems were rampant. And the airline, under the air passenger protection regulations, all airlines have an obligation to rebook passengers or to try to on any airline, including competitors, if they themselves, the airlines, can't find a spot for that traveler on their own planes within 48 hours. It appears that WestJet made no real effort to rebook passengers on other airlines. They offered passengers refunds, and in some cases did rebook passengers, albeit days later. In some cases, flights were just completely dropped and passengers were given no indication as to what to do, no rebooking or anything. But that obligation to rebook with competitors if necessary seems to have been completely dropped, and the airline has not addressed that in questions that I've sent to it.
What do they say about how they handled that process amid the strike and in the days afterwards?
Well, the airline has apologized repeatedly to passengers. They have said they've made every effort to ramp up their operations as quickly and safely as possible. They did indeed offer refunds to virtually everyone whose flights were canceled. But in terms of rebooking, they have mostly cited what they say are the legal obligations, but they again haven't mentioned that rebooking with other airlines component that could have saved a lot of passengers' time and effort. Many passengers said they saw flights or they saw seats available on other airlines or even on WestJet flights in the days after the strike, but WestJet made no attempt, apparently, to rebook them on those. So there's still a lot of frustration, a lot of exasperation in the air. One more thing here. One person I spoke with, his flight was canceled partway through his trip home to Calgary a couple weeks ago, and that left him stranded in San Francisco. And he claimed that he saw available seats on an alternate WestJet flight within a couple days, but an auto email from WestJet just said there were no rebooking options, and he was encouraged to take a refund. And there was no one available at WestJet's ticket counters, he said. This was in San Francisco. WestJet only has a few spots around the continent where its own employees are at the ticket counters. Those are often contracted out. So rebooking was really a nightmare, and the airline has only partially accounted for why that was the case.
What about the rest of the money aside from the straight up refunds? You mentioned a couple of examples of people having to pay to stay in a city a couple of extra days as they wait for a flight, or some people who needed to get home for whatever reason and ended up buying seats on other airlines. What is WestJet obligated to do here to reimburse passengers under the law, and what do they say about that?
Advocates tell me that WestJet is obliged to reimburse those passengers, not compensation or damages, but just straight up reimbursement for costs incurred as a result of the strike if the airline was not able to rebook that person within 48 hours. Those costs could be a new flight with another airline. They could be hotel costs. They could be other transport costs like an Uber or a taxi. But the airline is not going to just do this proactively. A passenger would have to write to their customer relations in an email and request that reimbursement, perhaps attaching receipts. And if that claim is denied or ignored, then the passenger would have to go file a complaint with the Canadian Transportation Agency. However, there's a backlog of 72,000 plus complaints at this tribunal already, and it can take up to 2 years for a complaint over reimbursement to be processed. So another option for passengers might be to go to small claims court, but that can be an intimidating prospect for people to effectively file a lawsuit against a large corporation over a few hundred or perhaps a few $1,000s, which is a lot of money for most people. Those are the options before most people. And the airline has said it will assess reimbursement claims as they roll in, but we'll see how that plays out. I believe people have about 30 days to file reimbursement expenses, so it's a small time window too.
What about just straight up compensation for flights that were delayed or other costs that people took on because the airline couldn't get its act together here?
If your flight is delayed over 9 hours or it's just outright canceled and you couldn't be rebooked within a certain amount of time, then you are not only owed a refund, but you are owed compensation, effectively damages, of $1,000 in those cases. However, that refers to cancellations or long delays when the reason is within the airline's control. Under the air passenger protection regulations, labor disruption is listed as a cause that is outside the airline's control, the cause of a delay or a cancellation.
How does that work? I mean, aren't they the ones negotiating with the mechanics?
Undoubtedly, the airline has some role in how long a labor disruption lasts. It's true. But while this set of regulations is under review right now by the government, that is the case right now. However, there's a little gray area there. For example, when flights are still canceled 4 days after a strike ends, is that still within the carrier's control or not? It could be argued that that's fallout from the strike, but it's not during the strike. Similarly, flights were canceled more than 24 hours before, or about 24 hours before the strike began, as in WestJet anticipated a possible strike. Again, that's before a strike ever was launched, and it might not have happened at all. So that could arguably be within the carrier's control. In those cases, long after and shortly before a strike, passengers may well be owed up to $1,000 in compensation. However, should the airline reject that request from a passenger, again, the passenger has to take that to the Canadian Transportation Agency, which can be a very long wait indeed.
Is the Canadian Transportation Agency doing anything in a more systemic way to help people who were impacted, or is everybody who was affected at this point kind of just you're on your own and good luck?
Yeah. The chair of the agency told me last year that complaints were its main area of focus, and they have hired 100 dispute resolution officers, I believe is the term, to handle this still growing backlog of complaints, mostly related to compensation and refunds from airlines. But they've said that enforcement of the rules is kind of a secondary concern of theirs. While they do impose penalties, aside from complaints and refunds and reimbursement and compensation as a result of those complaints, they've imposed penalties on airlines that breach various rules, whether it's poor signage at an airport, not telling passengers about their rights, to an issue on the tarmac. But those penalties are small and few and far between, and really don't serve as disincentives for airlines that breach the rules. So while the agency may have changed its tune and could be looking into showing its teeth a little more as a regulator, to my knowledge, there's still a bit of a gap between what the rules say and what the enforcement of those rules could be.
One more question then, because I realize that math would dictate that at least somebody, probably multiple people listening to this, were impacted by this strike. For somebody who's listened to this and doesn't know what step to take next, where can they go to figure out exactly what they're entitled to and how to do it?
The airlines themselves have pages where you can go. If you were just to do a search on Google or any search engine, you could look up claim, compensation, or refund and the particular airline. But there's also several advocacy groups. Air Passenger Rights is one advocacy group that has some pretty detailed suggestions, step-by-step processes laid out as to what to do when a flight has been canceled, among other situations, lost baggage, for example. So the airlines and advocacy groups, especially APR would be the acronym there, are two places to go.
Chris, thank you so much for walking us through this mess.
Thank you very much. A pleasure.
Christopher Reynolds, a reporter with the Canadian Press. That was the big story. If you'd like more big stories, you can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can also simply scroll down in whatever app you're using to listen to this podcast. Of course, if you're not listening to this podcast on an app, you can search for whatever you like on our website. We've probably covered it. or you can ask your smart speaker to play another episode of the Big Story podcast. If you want to send us some feedback, and we covered politics last week, so we've been getting a little bit, you can do that by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or by calling us at 416-935-5935 and leaving a message. If you'd like us to, perhaps, when we do a feedback episode, use your voicemail on the air, you got to let us know that when you leave it. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.